welcome to this episode of the CNED Development Dialogues, Striving Together for Gender Equality. We'll have with us Dr. Dede Amanoe-Wilks. Dr. Dede is currently serving as the Executive Director of the Institute of Economic Affairs, Ghana. She holds a PhD from the University of Ghana and an MSc and MPhil in Economic History from the London School of Economics. She began her career as a journalist and editor and subsequently moved into the policy space. She is a very eminent African lady, very well known, and has written extensively, and her work has been published in a number of places, and her work has also been broadcast in a number of places like the BBC and Al Jazeera. She's the right person to be talking about gender inequality with us today. Dr. Dede, welcome to ORF CNED Development Dialogues.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Let me move to my first question, which is that we find that women face several disadvantages, and the disadvantage typically starts from the womb. So even being born as a woman is a bit of a difficulty. We have an adverse sex ratio in India, so our discrimination literally begins from the womb. But what, in your opinion, is the most important discrimination? In which field is the discrimination the most pressing, which literally affects women from and prevents them from achieving their full potential? Is it the lack of economic opportunities? Is it the lack of education? Or is it the lack of being in positions where they can take decisions?
Well, if I was to single out a guiding factor, I would say education. And probably especially technical education. I would say that education is the most critical factor in overcoming all the obstacles to women's fuller participation, which I'm sure we'll talk about more. I think education is really the leveler, the answer to all of the inequalities. Of course, it's not the only factor. Attitudes have to change in order to create the space for greater gender balance. There's competition, for example, in elections, and we can elaborate on this as we go along, but education would be my number one.
The Global Gender Gap Report, published by the World Economic Forum, presents a very grim picture on gender inequality. We have to wait for a century to achieve gender parity. I mean, this is just not acceptable. We can't wait for a century. So, to do things in a much shorter time frame, we need to achieve things faster. For that, we would need radical changes in the economy, in the society, and governments have to play a very important role. So what are the changes that you would recommend?
Well, in Africa, where 70% of people are employed on the land, I would start from the basics. Access to land would be a critical factor. Access to land is very difficult for women, most particularly, and the youth. So that would be number one in terms of the primary economies of African countries. And then access to affordable and sustainable energy, both for people on the land and for small businesses. And most women are employed in the informal sector in small businesses. Others would be access to business capital, access to technology or technical skills, and probably what is really going to be critical is affirmative action, the dreaded word, affirmative action. We find that women in public life, especially in the industrial sectors, in industry and in mining, women are underrepresented at the highest levels. And without some form of affirmative action, it seems unlikely that we'll change things radically before the century is out.
I'm very glad that you spoke about Africa, because that would be my next question. Because, typically when we talk about most of the development indicators, including gender, we tend to look at the West. But in case of gender equality, we have an African country which I think is the best when it comes to gender parity, and that is Rwanda. So what is it that Rwanda does very differently? What is it that India and other African countries can learn from Rwanda?
Yes, and I agree with you. This is one African example that the whole world can learn from. Indeed, since Rwanda so emphatically took the lead to become the world's first country to achieve a female majority in parliament, there's been a greater impetus globally, you can see, to boost the representation of women in decision making. at the beginning of 2019, about a year ago, Rwanda had 61.3% of seats held by women in parliament, which was unprecedented until then. And you can see that other African countries have also been striving to get there. There are a few that are doing pretty well too. Namibia has 46.2%, South Africa almost 43%, Senegal almost 42%, Mozambique almost 40%, Ethiopia 39%. And Ethiopia last year has appointed its first female president. Tanzania almost 37%, Burundi 37%, and Tunisia 36%. So we are doing quite well in those states. Rwanda is a bit, the reason I wanted to mention some of the other countries is it's not only Rwanda, is that Rwanda is a bit of a special case, both in terms of gender representation and more broadly in terms of economic development. Because of Rwanda's particular history, the history of the genocide, it does seem that Rwanda has been able to get away with a lot more than other countries would be able to, in terms of putting in place policies that in other countries would be considered inimical to human rights, for example, that people would criticize on the basis of human rights. But in terms of their gender strategy, it has been very much President Kagame's decision to simply appoint women, to have a majority representation in women. And I think it has paid off. I know at the beginning there were a lot of grumblings and you'd hear people saying, oh, she's only been appointed because she's from this or that group, that sort of thing. But as it has stuck and the determination to have so many women in public life has stuck, you can see that the country is really benefiting from this economically. And I think it has also inspired all kinds of studies now on the relationship between economics and gender. And we have a lot of research coming out, especially from the World Bank and the IMF, showing that having more representation of women in public life translates to greater GDP. So I think there's a lot that we're all learning from this, and countries are making more effort now to emulate the example of Rwanda. Having said that, I have to add, sadly, that my own country, Ghana, and probably India too, are not doing well at all. And this surely reinforces the argument for affirmative action. Indeed, the UN claims that the 30% quota is only possible with affirmative action. Ghana, after a really great start at independence, when Kwame Nkrumah introduced some special seats for women, had special elections which brought 10 women into parliament, which at that time, because there was only a 100-member parliament, represented 10% of the parliament. Today, after 60 years, it's barely changed. It's still 11%, 12%. I think it's never gone higher than 13, almost 14%. And currently, I believe it's about 12 to 13%. And this reinforces the notion that if you don't have some kind of quota system, affirmative action, things are not really going to change by themselves. It's actually quite embarrassing for the ruling party, because although our president is a UN special representative, a champion, UN special champion on gender, and although the Speaker of Parliament has come out very strongly to say he wants to see the affirmative action bill passed this year before the December election, very embarrassingly, in the last election, when the ruling party tried to keep safe seats for women in their primaries, the youth of the party stormed the party headquarters, refusing this policy, and they had to actually reverse it. And that has, resulted in Ghana not increasing its representation of women in parliament. I understand that India too is not doing well in the global states, although India was one of the first to have a female president and a prime minister. So it does.
A prime minister, not a president yet.
Sorry,
India. We first had the female prime minister and the president came much later. So, ma'am, I wanted you to speak a little bit about the current pandemic that we are going through. We observe that that women are much more affected than men. In the pandemic, the job losses have been in sectors where women are more prone to working. The service sector has been terribly affected where women work a lot. The beauty industry, the healthcare industry, where women are basically much more represented, teaching, etc. So, I mean, a lot of people are calling it she session. This recession is she session. A lot of girls are out of school. Women are having to work from home, and that has increased their burden of childcare, taking care of the elderly, and committing to work in their offices. So we run the risk of negating many of the achievements that we had, in terms of lifting women out of poverty, in terms of bringing women into the workforce, in terms of putting girls into school. So, I mean, the progress hasn't been as good as we would have wanted. And on the other hand, we find ourselves in a situation where we can actually reverse some of the little modest gains that we had made. So what, in your opinion, should be the correct response to the pandemic?
Well, yes, you're right. It does appear that gender equality is worse during pandemics. And we've seen that during the Ebola crisis in Africa, that gender inequality worsened, that economic recession pushes more women into poverty, and the closure of schools can impact girls, especially more negatively, putting them at risk of things like teenage pregnancy. So, well, steps that government should take, first and foremost, is to include gender in the design of any COVID-19 response policies. Gender must be specifically targeted. So women's livelihoods need to be protected during pandemic. And it's been found that cash transfers can be a very effective way of protecting women's livelihoods. There is some evidence from Nigeria showing that women who receive cash transfers are those who tend to work, are those who are able to continue working during the pandemic, and that women invest the cash transfers in assets, in their businesses, and in household recovery. So the money goes far when you give it to a woman. Governments should also take measures to boost women's productivity, their earnings, their market inclusion, to accelerate the economic recovery. So in as much as we've all sort of been on pause, on a semi-pause over the last few months, it is a good opportunity to start putting in place the kind of policies that would enable women to get out there once things recover, to really take up their role as actors in the economy and sort of help the recovery in a much fuller way. Because women represent 58% of self-employed people in Africa. So imagine if you give a boost to those 58%, what it will do for the overall economy. Women-owned businesses are very vulnerable to shocks. They're mostly in the informal sector or in less profitable sectors. But they found in Ethiopia that women entrepreneurs who received loans, even though 66% of them were first-time borrowers, did manage to increase their profits by 40% over 3 years. This is before the coronavirus crisis. But it just shows that if we were to make credit and cash available to women now, it will aid the recovery in the next 2 to 3 years. Then other things like training for women, especially in terms of personal initiative, agricultural support. It's been found that when households receive oxen, for example, it's not that the oxen go to women, but that when the household heads have more support, are able to free up their labor, it also enables women to shift their labor towards self-employment. And then special programs for adolescent girls would make a big difference during this crisis.
Dr. Dede, what we find is that, some sectors are performing better than some of the other traditional sectors, like agriculture particularly has been a cause of concern in India for a long time. But there is some scope of employment in the high technology sectors, in AI, in cloud computing, in data and engineering. And these sectors require very high skills. And you've observed before that it is the skills gap and the lack of skills training which is keeping women away from achieving their potential. So we know henceforth most of the jobs will be created in these few sectors. So how can we make sure more women enter into IT, into finance, into AI? I mean, what should be? I mean, affirmative action is a point that you've mentioned, and I fully agree with it. But I mean, would the private sector agree with it? Would you call for affirmative action in the private sector also? I mean, how should we deal with that?
Yes, I think there are increasing calls for affirmative action in the private sector because it's being found that there is a gap at the top. Increasingly, studies by the World Bank and others show that the equitable participation of women in the labor market can increase GDP. In Africa, it's been shown to increase GDP from between 1% in a country like Senegal to 50% in a country like Niger. I think, first of all, governments have to recognize that closing the skills gap is good for economics and broadcast that loudly and widely. Once people understand this, then it becomes easier for them to accept that affirmative action, that quotas, would be good for everybody, not just for the women. The gender gap is very apparent in low-income sectors of the economy. You mentioned agriculture, where you find women working predominantly in family farms and household enterprises. And it's only at high levels of income and education that we see the gender gaps in the labor market starting to close. So we probably need policies to get more women into the formal sector. We need to create linkages between formal and informal sectors. Women need tax incentives, for example, maybe waivers too on registration fees that stop them registering their businesses in the formal sector, access to microfinance. And that's where we can learn a lot in Africa from India's Grameen Bank. Quality education for girls and more scholarships for girls in STEM, the science studies, science, technology, engineering and mathematics, and TVET, technical, vocational and educational training. We also need to do basic things like address the problems of childcare, because if women don't have childcare, that means there are few options for them. That's why you find women mostly in the informal sector, because if a woman's working in the market, she can take her children with her. If she's working in an office, she can't take her children with her. So how do we solve the problems for low-income women of childcare? And then broadcasting this in the home, we need to use the power of the mass media and bolder communications and ad campaigns to change attitudes and perceptions in the home. Because once people realize in the home how much they are going to benefit, and the whole economy will benefit when girls and women are better integrated in the economy, we'll find that attitudes will change, that families will be less reluctant to get their girl children into education and into formal training. So in addition to your normal ad campaigns on television, which won't reach many people in the rural areas, we should really be targeting community radio, have a mass campaign on community radio to reach every corner of the country.
Dr. Dede, I mean, we agree that we should do all this, but to make all these things happen, I think we need more women taking these political decisions. And that is a very, very significant gap. And it is a gap which I think is the most difficult one to bridge. That to have all these progressive legislation, we need to have more women in the parliament to be discussing it. It's all easy for us to say that we should have government-run childcare centers, or the government should spend more on childcare, and the government should spend more on women's education. But I think somewhere down the line, these issues do not receive as much attention because there aren't enough women to take these decisions forward. So how should countries in Africa and India try? Africa is, of course, I think, doing slightly better than us on this count, and we have something to learn from many of the African countries. But what could be the ways to get women to participate more actively in politics, for them to be able to get elected, for them to be able to get the ticket to fight elections?
Well, you're right, Malancha. And this is a challenging question globally, because globally women have only 23.65% of parliamentary positions, although it's recognized increasingly that better representation of women in decision-making makes for more peaceful and stable societies. And so it does seem that multiple strategies are needed to address the top 5 barriers to female participation in politics. And studies have shown that these barriers are, number one, domestic responsibilities and time poverty. So we've talked about the problem of childcare. Women really suffer from time poverty. Number 2, cultural attitudes regarding the role of women in society. Number 3, women who want to go into politics often face lack of support from their families. Number 4, a lack of confidence. And number 5, very critically, the lack of finances to go into politics. These findings are from a study called Equality in Politics, a survey of women and men in parliaments, which was undertaken in 2008 by the Interparliamentary Union. So what are the solutions? Well, civil society advocacy, we have been advocating for a long time, and we have to continue. I've been hearing some interesting ideas from some women civil society activists in Ghana recently. It's become popular in the last 2 Ghanaian elections. The electorate, so there are 2 trends. The electorate, on one hand, are becoming very cynical about politicians to the extent where they see elections as a time to sell their vote, because they say, well, we won't see you again after the election. So, you know, if you want me to vote for you, you have to give me money because I know I won't see you again. That's on the one hand, the cynicism is expressed like that. But on the other hand, there's a positive trend where electorates now say, if you want my vote, we want this road or we want this bridge. They particular development interventions. Now, I've recently been hearing women activists saying, if you want my vote, we're going to say that all women shouldn't vote in this election at all, unless the position of women is improved. Now, that would require quite a massive campaign, but maybe that might be one way to go. It might take a long time to plan it and effect it, but that might be an effective campaign to get women to support the notion that unless we have more women's representation, we're not going to vote. And there's going to be a lot of hurdles to overcome, because a lot of people argue that it's the women that don't vote for women. So we have to start by working with women to try and overcome that prejudice. Then I think other interventions that could help: capacity building for female candidates before the elections, in things like leadership skills, campaign strategy, fundraising, and networking. But I also think after women elected, it's also very important that they should get some post-election mentorship. I have seen a trend where women get elected to really very important and sensitive positions, but then it seems quite easy at times to bring them down. They're easily targeted by some of the masculine behaviors. Perhaps women are not aware of the kind of politics, shall we say, politics that can be used to bring them down. And I think it would be nice to pair women who are just entering parliament and other forms of public life with more seasoned women who could sort of point out some of the pitfalls and landmines and take them through them. So some of the approaches, besides quota systems, affirmative actions that are being considered around the world, are proportional representation. It's felt that that's one system that would in some way bring more women into public life. But public education is also very important. So before you can work with women to convince them to vote for more women and give them very tangible and financial reasons why it would be good to have more women in public life, a lot of public education is required. And perhaps that's why, although governments espouse this commitment to the 30% quotas, it doesn't go through, probably because not enough public education has been done among both men and women to convince the electorate and the public at large that we need more women in public life.
Dr. Dede, my last question is more forward-looking. We want to end on a real positive note. I mean, I would like to know what India and Africa can do together. I mean, you must know about India's development cooperation strategy in Africa. And I mean, the heads of state at the highest level, we've agreed that, India and Africa will together work together for better development outcomes in their respective countries. So what is your opinion about India's development cooperation strategy, looking at it through the gender lens? I mean, is it gender blind, or you see some positives in it which can lead to better outcomes? What would be your suggestions for the future?
Well, I think probably on both sides, our development strategies have been gender blind up to this point, and this is the opportunity now to put the gender lens on them. I mean, India is a fascinating country historically for Africa. India's always historically been at the forefront of development, and one of the biggest questions indeed in economic history is why the Industrial Revolution happened in Britain and not in countries such as China, Holland, or India. Colonialism did set back the course of development in India, as British colonial policy was to crush the Indian textile industry, as we well know. Yet today, India is again emerging as one of the world's great global economies. The economy is booming, and India can now afford to think about its strategy for development cooperation. So I'm sure now this really is the time to think about gender. South-South cooperation goes back a long time to the beginning of independence, 1947 in India and 1957 in Ghana, which was the first independent country in Africa. The relationship between India and Ghana grew very strong through the non-aligned movement. And the principles of South-South cooperation is partnership between equals based on solidarity, with principles of mutual gain, non-interference, collective growth opportunities, no conditionalities. Now is a time really to, when I try to think of it through a gender lens, Amartya Sen has this beautiful definition of development as expanding people's choices. And looking at that example I gave of the textile industry, that's perhaps the textile industry is very important to Africa, as it has been historically to India. And so I'd just like to maybe zoom in on this example so that we can think more closely about how we can give a gender lens to our development cooperation. I think that to achieve, within that ethos of the non-aligned movement and South-South cooperation, if we are to achieve meaningful cooperation, I think that the unhealthy competition must be avoided at all costs. And this is where India's collaboration with India, as in the case of Chinese cooperation, what makes Chinese cooperation so interesting to Africa is the desire to avoid conditionalities and unhealthy competition. So when you look at the textile industry, in Ghana, we have this textile, which is called Kente cloth. I don't know if you've ever seen. I brought some here to show you. Hand woven cloth. Have you ever seen Kente cloth? It's almost signature cloth.
Yeah.
It's Ghana's signature cloth, and it's almost come to represent sort of African identity. Here's another one, African identity. And like in the diaspora, African Americans use this cloth. Here's another one. Use this cloth to signify sort of their African identity, and it's used in Ghana and in Africa, South Africa. It's used in the diaspora for graduation and things like that. It's a very strong symbol. Now, when I did some research on the production of this cloth, and I was interested to find out why women, you see very few women weavers. So interesting, that has been changing over the last few years. Now women are starting to weave, whereas there was a taboo until a few years ago on women weaving, a long-standing taboo going back 300 years to the beginning of the development of this cloth, which was initially for kings. And then it has now become a symbol of national unity, national dress, very much like the sari in India. Now, when I was doing research on this cloth, it took me to a project in Accra, the capital. It's produced, the original weaving town is in the surroundings of Kumasi, which is in the center of Ghana, about 5 hours drive from Accra. And the weavers had come to Accra to participate in a project. They had been called to come and participate in a project. And interestingly, the project had brought broad loom weavers from India to teach the Kente weavers. So those two strips I showed you, and these are produced on narrow looms. And then, so they're produced strips like this, and then the strips are stitched together to make the broad cloth like this. And so the Indian weavers had come to teach the Ghanaian weavers how to produce them on narrow strips. Oh, no, sorry, on broad looms. And the advantage of the broad loom is that you have a bigger cloth. You can achieve more economies of scale. The cloth can be cheaper and so forth. But what I found fascinating was after a few months of doing this, the Kente weavers withdrew. They didn't want to participate in the project anymore. And I started thinking about what it is that makes this narrow Kente strip persist after all these centuries when we could have moved to the broad loom. And I think that cooperation goes beyond, economic principles of, maximizing profit. Because one thing about this cloth is it's not just something that you wear, it also is a great signifier of culture. Because in this cloth, every single motif, every single pattern has a significance. And sometimes weavers use the weaving of this cloth to send a message. So people will choose a cloth that gives a message that they want to convey because every pattern has a message. It might be a message to your rival, to somebody you love. It could be a message, for example, Ghana's first president, they wove a cloth which had a proverb woven into it, which means one man doesn't constitute a council. So you can send very powerful messages. So it just made me think that in trying to find a form of cooperation, and this goes as much for the cooperation between India, the Indian subcontinent, and Africa, but as Africa now moves towards creating one continental free trade area, it's one of the greatest dangers is that Africa could become overwhelmed by cheap products from around the world, Europe, Asia, including India and China. And so this is very much the time for us to say, what is it that we're all going to produce and still respect each other's uniqueness and not try to produce what somebody else, another country has been producing for centuries. So for example, Ghana has become flooded with print imitations of this Kente weaving, which, because of this narrow loom technology, is not efficient. It's not economically efficient for any other country to try and produce Kente because the weavers self-exploit. They can spend 3 months weaving one cloth, a gorgeous cloth, or 6 months even. Whereas if you print it, it's a cheap imitation, everybody can afford it, but it doesn't have the same significance. So it occurred to me, for example, what would it do to India if suddenly the sari were being produced by other countries and India's sari was being overwhelmed? It would take away from Indian culture in the same way that Ghana has been very keen to protect its Kente industry, even if it's not the most economically efficient way of producing cloth. And so I do think that this is now the time to think about interventions that can target what is of value to each country in our culture, and also what would improve the situation of women within those cultures. So although now there are women who weave now, but still women are mostly responsible for the marketing of this cloth. What can we do to target women, to improve their marketing of this cloth, to improve their situation in the marketplace, and then improve their income, their finances? So eventually, if they want to weave, they would be able to weave. At the moment, what prevents women weaving is that they can't afford the yarns, and the men don't want to give them the yarns because they don't want competition. It's now come down to, the taboo was really about eliminating the competition from women. So how can we empower women so that they can then enlarge their choices and decide, no, I do want to become a weaver, regardless of whether it's supposed to be a man's domain. Now, I think one of the examples that I just mentioned briefly before is Grameen Bank in India. Maybe this is one thing that we really could do to empower women in Africa, to have a development bank for women that can be controlled by women and which women can use then to get other women into positions of political power, into businesses that have been closed to women, use it to demand affirmative action or to get quotas for women. It would just increase the bargaining power of women across the economy. And that's really the note on which I would like to end. So is Indian policy gender blind? Is African development policy gender blind? We need inclusiveness. Inclusiveness is an issue in both India and Ghana. And as gender blind as development policy appears to be in both countries, we need to mainstream gender in development projects and strategies in both countries, which would be in line with the SDGs. Once we commit to partnership based on equality, then addressing gender issues will become inescapable. It's that commitment to the SDGs that both our countries hold that makes it imperative that we now address gender issues in developing our cooperative development cooperation strategy. Grameen Bank should be the great Indian inspiration for Africa, because in the end, achieving equality for women is about giving them resources they need to establish themselves and to compete on an equal footing with men, to gain access to land and labor and equipment and technology to till their lands or establish their businesses and industries. And that brings us back to the question of affirmative action, which is in line with the SDGs Goal 5. I'd like to end on that note.
Thank you, Anne. That was fabulous. It's been very exciting speaking to you. Thanks a lot. The two main points that I would draw from this conversation is that affirmative action is really important for gender equality, to ensure that women achieve their full potential, and of course that development cooperation strategy and development projects need to have a gender element and must be seen through the gender lens. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thanks a lot for speaking with us. That's all we have today. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Malancha. Thank you.